The best example is the Friday night Seudah. And the Friday night Seudah, in my view, is the ultimate classroom for Yiddishkeit for your children. And I find very often parents fail to appreciate the intensity of that experience.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shtark Tank, the podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. This week, we sit down with Moishe Bane. After a long and successful career in big law, he cut back on his legal practice to serve as president of the OU. We spoke about how to struggle with big decisions, the recognition that life is made up of different stages, and the underrated importance of schmoozing. My name is Yaakov Wolff, and this is Shtark Tank. So we're going to frame this conversation around a course that you teach at Sims School of Business called Designing Your Jewish Life. And you described to me before that you don't really teach the course in a classic sense. You don't really tell guys what to do or give over ready-made conclusions. And you told me that the whole framing of this course that you give over was inspired by your Rebbe, Rav Weinberg, and his approach to life in general. So maybe you could start by sharing that with us.
Sure. I think you're correct. The way the course is structured, and I make very clear to the students at the outset that I'm going to be dealing with a whole variety of topics that they're going to have to confront during the course of their adult life. And my objective is not to give them answers or directives, but rather to present to them factors that they be well taken into account when they confront these different choices. I think it really derives from a perspective that Avodas Hashem has three dimensions to it, at least in this framework. One is halacha, and there are, in fact, two mandatory courses in Sims in halacha that every student needs to take in order to graduate. And that's to know what the halacha is, what you have to do, what you don't have to do, both in terms of isurim and chiyuvim, etc. Then there's a sphere of emunah that is another part of Yiddishkeit, and particularly the Rambam makes very clear how fundamental that is and how much of a prerequisite that is to successful Avodas Hashem. But then there's a third area, and that is living your life, making decisions, making choices that are not necessarily exclusively halachic in nature, but are choices in lifestyle and things that have to do with your everyday life outside of ritual, outside of actual halachic mandates. And in that regard, Rav Weinberg always used to emphasize to us two things. Number one is how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares about what we do and our choices, and how significant each individual is. And therefore, you can't just step back and say, well, what's the difference? What I do, it's not significant. Every individual, particularly every Jew, has such an incredible connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and is so significant that you have to take your life seriously. But the second dimension, which really goes to the point that you're raising, is the emphasis that the choice you make is not going to be the criteria that HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses to judge your success. It's going to be the process by which you made that choice, the objectivity, the factors you considered, the degree to which, for example, you consider, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want me to do in these circumstances? And in order to make that choice in a responsible way, you need to be given and ensured to have the factors that you should be considering when making that choice, not only in terms of information, but equally important, what process should you be pursuing in deriving a conclusion on any one of a vast variety of choices that you're confronted, number one, on a daily basis. But even more concerning is like the major decisions that you make that will, Rav Dessler calls it the nekudas habechira, that very often you're confronted with particular dilemmas that will dictate a myriad subsequent decisions by virtue of that initial decision. How do you reach that decision? What's the process by which you reach that decision? And that's what I'm trying to empower the students with, the tools to do that.
Wow. And I guess I hear how it can obviously be very destructive to have an overly careless, go with the flow attitude towards these big decisions. But you could also go to the other extreme and get overly paralyzed, especially when people are trying to hold different values and balance, different challenging decisions in life. So can you talk to that point of finding the right middle ground of thinking through things, being responsible, taking it seriously, but not letting it get to our head and weigh down on us too much?
Well, I of course, that's a significant issue, and you have to distinguish between different categories of decisions. For example, Rav Aaron Lapiansky Shlita always talks about the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu imbued within the human nature the fact that we do so many things by rote. And the question is, well, if we're supposed to be making decisions, why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu create that instinctual reaction to so many ordinary course things? And Rabbi Lopiansky explains that, well, if we were caught up in every detail of our lives, I get out of bed, okay, how do I put my leg down? How do I tie my shoe? Then you won't have the brain space. You won't have the capacity to focus on decisions that are real decisions. So I think one of the challenges in the decision process is determining what are decisions that warrant extreme attention. And that's part of the responsibility that you have. Anything you decide should always be done deliberately. There was a very famous incident back when I was in yeshiva that there were a group of Talmidim at Rav Weinberg's house on a Friday night for an Oneg Shabbos. And in the middle of the Oneg Shabbos, the Rebbitzin brought out a platter of cake. And obviously none of us wanted to take cake. You all sit there very timid and reluctant. And Rav Weinberg finally turns to one of the Bachrim and says, take a piece of cake. And the Bachar leans over and takes a piece of cake. And then Rav Weinberg looks at him and says, why'd you take that piece of cake? He goes, I don't know. I took that piece of cake. Was it the biggest piece? Was it the closest piece? Was it the kind of cake you like? And obviously the point he was making, which we took very, very seriously because we spent a lot of time talking about it afterwards, is that he was trying to convey to us everything you do should be deliberate. Even if the decision is that this does not warrant a lot of time and brain space, you have to decide that. And therefore, you're able to live a life that is truly Avodas Hashem, rather than just casually living and doing things without attention to detail and attention to whether this warrants the kind of attention.
And how do you think about the balance between trusting your own instincts, looking in Chazal and the Torah for clues, hints, values to be driving us, speaking to Rebbeim, speaking to spouses and other family members? Every significant decision, even some minor ones, could potentially have all these sort of points of input. So can you give us a little bit of an overview of how to incorporate all of those different sources of Torah values, of human values, and of decision-making processes?
Well, I'll present to you the process that I developed in my mind for how you confront a decision. And I suggest that there are 4 steps. The first step is preparing. And preparing is, number one, deciding how significant this decision is. How much attention does it warrant? What are the factors I need to have in order to make that decision? What kind of information do I need to collect? That's preparing. Once I've decided this decision warrants the attention, number one, I have to decide, is this a decision that should be made today? One of the interesting points that I try to convey, and it's true with regard to even much more mature people, but certainly young people, but even mature people, is that you really should not make a decision until you need to make a decision. And the reason I say that is that we get smarter every day. We get more mature every day. We get more experienced every day. So until I need to make a decision, won't I prefer to collect more experience and more wisdom before I have to actually grapple with the decision? But there's a caveat. And the caveat clearly is I can't defer making the decision if that deferring is going to eliminate options, because that de facto is making a decision itself. So the first thing I have to do is decide, preparing. Should I make a decision today? What would I be forfeiting if I'm not? And if I should make that decision, what is the process by which I need to pursue? The second is the gathering stage. The gathering stage is I have to collect the information. The information may be factual information. It may be scientific information. I have to decide whether to do this medical procedure. I got to collect the science. It may be legal. I have to consult where are there legal, and of course, are there halachic considerations? And then as you're suggesting, I have to consider, are there hashkafic pieces of the puzzle that I need to make sure I'm considering? Rav Weinberg was very adamant in teaching us the importance of having a Rebbe. And at that point in time in the gathering, you have to consult with your Rebbe. You also have to consult with chaverim. There may be other people who are impacted that you also should be consulting with, your parents, your friends, the experts. So that's the gathering step. Once you've gone through the step of preparing and then you've gathered, then you have to go to the third step. And the third step is considering what is that information that you gathered. Very often there are conflicting messages among competing messages you've gotten from different sources. The science may conflict with the law. The hashkafa may conflict with the practical advice you're getting. And you have to then assess that. And that's a third step. And that in many regards is the most challenging of the steps. And the final step, and this is a stage that many people falter at, and that is actually making the decision. There are many people who simply don't have the wherewithal to conclude making a decision, and very often they forget that not making a decision is often making a decision. And therefore, you have to realize that is a significant step, making a decision.
I love that. And I want to get into some of the actual topics that you raised. But even before that, just on the structural level, I am wondering, is there also maybe a fifth stage, a post stage, where you live with the decision and maybe someone could say you made it and now you have to forget about it, or continue to get smarter because of the decision and its implications, the questions of regret and not looking back and managing all of those factors that go along in a person's mind and a person's life after the...
Well, there are two seemingly conflicting dimensions that need to be considered in that fifth, as you reflect, stage. On one hand, very often people determine the correctness and the legitimacy of their decision by its outcome. And one of the recognitions that I've reached over the years and decades is that may not necessarily be a fair assessment. So often we make a decision and there are factors that come into play that we could not possibly have considered that may either cause the decision to have turned out well or cause it to turn out poorly. But the fact that the decision turned out well or poorly does not necessarily mean that we made the right or wrong decision. The decision was made in the context of what was available at the time, the degree to which we struggled honestly and objectively, to the degree that we actually consulted with the right sources. And even if the decision turns out to be terrible in terms of its outcome, it may have been the right decision at the time. And frankly, the fact that it worked out well may have not been because you made the right decision. So on one hand, that's clearly something that you need to make sure you don't get caught up in. By the same token, you need to learn from mistakes. You need to be reflective in your life. I think in that regard, the biggest challenge, and you use the term regret, and the word regret is the right word, because there's an alternative word that people live with, which is not, as Rav Weinberg would repeatedly tell us, is not a Jewish emotion, which is guilt. There's a very big difference between feeling guilty because you made a wrong decision and feeling regret because you made a wrong decision. Guilt is paralyzing. Guilt is wallowing in the past. Regret is learning from the past and taking it to influence our future. So you're absolutely correct. We should always be reflective. We should always be considering, what am I able to gain from decisions I made, either because of their success or because of their failure. But it shouldn't be paralyzing. It shouldn't be wallowing in the past. That's not a productive Torah perspective.
Amazing. So let's get to some of the actual issues. And you also mentioned to me that you use a framing which we find in Chazal, that different stages of life require different emphases or bring in different changes in how we approach certain things. So let's start with the transition from yeshiva to after yeshiva and how we treat Torah learning when we're younger, maybe getting a little bit older. And you actually have written some articles about this, about how we sort of think about yeshiva, approach yeshiva, and how we approach Torah learning afterwards. So you could start by how we should be thinking about that struggle and those decisions in that regard.
Sure, but let me preliminarily just address your introduction to this stage of our discussion, which is the consideration of different steps in life. And one of the discoveries that I reached over the last many years, and particularly involved in community life and traveling around the country and meeting people, is the failure of people to even recognize that life is full of stages. And what people very often do is that they enmesh themselves in a certain approach to whatever dimension of life, whether it is the degree of their learning, the degree of their chesed involvement, the degree of how much time they spend between family and work. And they fail to recognize that every decision needs to be readdressed at different stages in life. And we go through these transitional stages almost carelessly, without paying significant consideration to it. And what we do then is we live in a static lifestyle that may no longer be applicable, even if the initial decisions were entirely correct. And that comes up throughout life. It comes up from the time as you're now raising, from the transition from Torah learning on a full-time basis to being involved in career or other dimensions of life. It changes from being single to being married, from being married to having children, from having children at home full-time to the time they leave, from the time that you're struggling to make a living to the time that you may be successful, and thereafter. So each stage requires a revisiting of significant decisions, not to revisit whether they were right decisions, but revisiting whether those correct decisions are still applicable, are still correct in our new stage in life. And clearly, as you identified a couple of moments ago, one of the very significant transitions that we take in life is for the yeshiva person is leaving yeshiva either on a part-time or full-time basis and entering the workforce. And what I lamented in my articles on a number of occasions is what I perceive, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think I'm right just based on my observations, that one of the directives or impressions that we develop while we're in yeshiva may be misgotten. And that is that we are told, and I remember being told this b'pemole, that these years in yeshiva, this is the pinnacle of your Torah experience. This is the pinnacle of your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Your job is to have such an intense experience while you're in yeshiva that for the rest of your life, you'll be able to hang on to tidbits of this incredible intensity. And I observe that I had perceived, and certainly in retrospect perceived, that that's a total mistake. What should be emphasized is this yeshiva experience is intended to give you the platform to continue to grow and grow and grow at every stage of your life, not to be the pinnacle, but rather to be the foundation going forward. And the parallel I propose is if you would tell a young couple under the chuppah, guys, this is the pinnacle of your love. In Avodas Hashem, the rest of your life, you should be able to hang on to at least a tidbit of the love you currently have. What a disastrous marriage you're preparing for these people. And the same thing is true for the Ben Torah. You have to be looking at your yeshiva experience as your preparation stage, but be aspiring to continue to grow. It may not be in the same manner. It may be with different challenges to overcome and different aspirations to achieve, but it should be a lifelong aspiration to continue to grow and grow and grow. You know, when I was young, even before reaching yeshiva age, I was an adamant reader of fiction. I loved reading fiction. And when you read fiction, particularly quality fiction, you begin to realize that every novel has a central character. And not only that, but every central character has a defining moment. And that defining moment is what the book is about. And half of the book or part of the book will be leading up to the defining moment. And then the balance of the book after the defining moment, we'll talk about its ramifications and its effects thereafter. I suggest that a Ben Torah needs to live his life assuming his defining moment has not yet occurred. No matter what he has achieved, no matter what he has accomplished, his defining moment has yet to happen, and everything that has happened until then is preparing him for that following future defining moment. That you should always be aspiring. There's something ahead, yet that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving me strength, is giving me life, he's giving me that opportunity to continue to grow. And if I don't look at it that way, I'm rejecting the largesse and the benevolence that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is providing to me.
Wow. When I read that article, I loved the mashal between yeshiva and the love under the marriage. And one aspect, and you'll forgive me, I don't remember if this was part of your writing, or maybe I thought of it in response to it, was the fact that the original stage is really exciting, has a lot of very visceral passions and emotions, and a lot of sparks and fireworks. And the later stages don't have that. In marriage, true, that can be in marriage also, this can be a challenge where people think, well, the sparks aren't there anymore, so they have a bit of a crisis. But as you also pointed out, there's something much more real and true about the long-term, steady, slow development of the marriage relationship and the Torah relationship, even though it lacks that fire that the early stages. And so how do you recommend sort of thinking about both those stages and not feeling bad that they don't have that original excitement?
Well, excitement is an emotion that is invigorating, but it's not sustaining. And I think that as you mature, you begin to appreciate that a longevity of a relationship, a development of a relationship, a maturation of a relationship is not manifest in emotions of excitement, but rather in emotions of connection. And that connection that you develop with your spouse over the decades, if you're blessed to have a long and healthy and enjoyable, productive marriage, is the same thing that you're trying to develop with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a depth of connection, not the excitement. I remember years ago learning, I think it was Rav Tzadok HaKohen who says this, that there's a reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows us to get used to something. Because in the example that I was given when I was taught this idea is when the yeshiva bacher puts on tefillin the first time and it's so intense and so exciting, it's not exciting because he's doing a mitzvah. He's excited because he's doing something new and he's putting on tefillin for the first time. It's only when he loses that excitement that finally he could be engaged in the excitement of mitzvah, the depth of the mitzvah. And it's the same thing with marriage. Once you get past the infatuation stage, then you could begin to develop the depth of a relationship that you're trying to achieve. But I'll share with you another observation that may or may not resonate with you. You struggle sometimes with the normative nature of our halachic and Avodas Hashem, that every day we daven 3 times a day, and we say the same tefillos, and we say the same Shemona Esreis, and it becomes rote in a certain degree, even if we try as hard as we can to have our focus on putting on tefillin correctly and davening correctly and learning our Siddurim correctly. And I was wondering a couple of months ago, I said, we have a relationship with our spouse, but there are moments of that excitement that it does reappear. And it could be at the most casual moment, it could be at an intense moment of experience. But I recognize that those sparks that do occur throughout life, even after decades of marriage, are only accessible if you have a continual, constant relationship. It's having the constant relationship that gives the opportunity for the intense experiences. And I think the same is true. You could daven the same tefillos day after day after day, and there'll be a moment that it comes through in a very intense way. And you can't just have intense. You need to have the ordinary course to develop the opportunity for that intensity. And that's something that you live throughout your life with. And you enjoy it, but the intensity may not be the goal. The intensity may just be the motivation to continue to do it on a daily basis, which is really what the avodah is.
That certainly resonates. I guess what it makes me think of is the fact that on the one hand, it's very much realistic to hope that the continual good habits will lead to certain sparks and peaks and special moments, both in marriage and in Avodas Hashem. On the other hand, sometimes you have some doubt and saying, like, if my batting average is really, 195, and I wouldn't make it to a major league roster with this batting average of how many tefillos I have kavana, or how many times my relationship with my wife actually feels meaningful. So, like, you can doubt yourself, like, is this really enough? Is this really a good benchmark? I guess it's probably harder to put a finger on, but I'm wondering if you have any sort of more sources that talk about that aspect, that, the habits that might not be so amazing lead to these moments which are amazing, and that is a healthy and normal framework that Akash Baruch Hu is happy with, and not, it's only once a week. So
one of the challenges that we have, and in this season of Adar, when we focus on Purim and the related concepts that we're focusing on during the Avodah of Purim, which is really based on a recognition of a relation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in an era of Hester Panim, we begin to realize that we have a hard time recognizing our relation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No matter how intense we may commit our time to or our efforts to, there's a degree of distance between being in touch with our neshamas and certainly our neshama's connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, it's very difficult and probably misleading to use our perception of emotional highs or triggers as a reflection of our success in developing that relationship. I remember Weinberg once said to us, the cannibal who's a headhunter also feels a surge of spirituality when he's cutting off someone's head and dancing around it. It's not spirituality, it's emotions. And we need to be very careful to distinguish between when we have feelings and we feel them to be spiritual, we feel them to be holy, whether that really is the holiness. The holiness may be the experiences that we have on the daily basis, where things are regular and ordinary course, and our neshama may be experiencing things that we can't really perceive. But we know through Chazal and through the halachas that we are taught that is what is connecting our neshama, even if we don't have these emotions. And it's by that recognition that we're able to sustain our commitment, recognizing, okay, emotions are nice, and they're a tool to be used. But when you're sitting around the kumzitz, and it's really beautiful, and you're staring at the bonfire in the middle, and you feel, wow, look at this ruchnius, that's really not the ruchnius. The ruchnius is because of that experience, you're going to go and keep mitzvahs better, you're going to learn Torah better. It's a motivation rather than a barometer in itself.
Wow. Okay. So we've covered some of the fundamental frameworks behind how you approach your teaching. We covered sort of learning and Avodas Hashem, and we hopped some marriage advice on the way while we were doing it. So let's get into work a little bit. We talked about going out to work. So what are some of the big questions, some of the big topics that people need to struggle with, contend with as it applies to choosing a career when you're very young, and also making career pivots and decisions later on in life?
Well, that's an incredibly important question that I fear many people do not struggle with, both in terms of their initial choices, as well as the pivots that you reference, which is very common today, that people go through different stages of their career and different types of jobs as they go along. And I think that we need to recognize that there are so many factors that go into the equation. And you mentioned earlier, the difficulty in life is balancing those factors. But in order to at least struggle with the balancing, you first have to be able to identify what should I be considering when I look at these options. And there are some that come to the fore very readily and we all focus on, such as, are there going to be halachic problems with Shabbos and kashrus? Am I going to have time in this job or that job? And what are the factors I should consider whether or not I should have a very demanding job or a lesser job? And those are all very significant considerations. But there are other considerations that are very often far less part of our focus. For example, am I looking for a position, a role that has inherent value? Am I looking for a role that has significant Avodas Hashem in the role itself? For example, is the role something that I'm providing chesed as an ordinary course? Or is the role not of that nature, but the result of the occupation, the result of the job will lead me to opportunities to do all kinds of incredibly important things, not the least of which is supporting my family. And therefore, the fact that my job itself may not have inherent value, for example, my career had at least the way I perceived it, had very little inherent value. I was a lawyer. I was practicing corporate restructuring law in a context in which the decisions I was trying to influence were which billionaire should get the $1 billion at the end of the day. I wasn't doing legal aid work. I wasn't helping poor, impoverished people who were trying to struggle or those who couldn't afford a lawyer. I was representing people who are incredibly wealthy and would be wealthy regardless of the outcome. The question is how wealthy they would be. I viewed my career as twofold. Number one, as I mentioned, supporting my family. But in addition, it was providing me with a context in order to do other things, to play roles in the community that platform was providing to me. And to me, in my assessment, that more than justified the amount of time and demands it took in order to pursue that kind of job. But for many people, no, I have a threshold. I could get a job that has inherent value. Now, even in the inherent value, we were taught early on in our yeshiva days that there is a split among schools in the Masorah in how I would consider this dichotomy. There's one school of thought, and this comes not only with regard to a commercial occupation, but also with regard to a klal-related occupation. One school will say, my choice has to focus on what I'm going to be doing on a daily basis. Is what I'm doing on a daily basis inherently kadosh? Not because of its outcome, but because what I'm doing I'm actually teaching Torah. I'm actually feeding the poor. I'm actually healing the sick. I'm doing something that inherently is a mitzvah in itself. And that's what I should use as my primary barometer of choosing what I'm doing, both in terms of chesed and in terms of my occupation. The second school says, yeah, those are important things to consider, but there's a different emphasis. And the emphasis is not on what you're doing, but what impact you're going to have by virtue of that choice. So, for example, classical illustration would be, I have a choice between being a Rebbe teaching 20 Talmidim a year, or being an individual who runs a major Mossad that facilitates there being 2,000 Talmidim learning every year, but I never get a chance to actually teach Torah. Which one is the route that I should be pursuing? And those are the two schools of thought. I'm clearly not in a position to dictate or even to suggest which is the primary or preferred approach, because we see among Gedolim people directing their Talmidim in one approach or the other. But that's a threshold issue that every person has to decide. What is my Masorah? What do my Rebbeim think? What do I think is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of me? And obviously it could be influenced by how dramatic my impact would be pursuing one approach or the other. So that's one arena that I think people need to be struggling with. Another arena in choosing an occupation, and this is much more in the commercial arena than in the Klal Kodesh arena, and that is that the dimensions of actual Yehados that people focus on, that I mentioned before, Kashrus, Shabbos, the Ichud, the various problems that we face, I have found, particularly in contemporary commercial worlds, that's manageable. We could figure it out. It's not saying that it's not going to be a challenge, but it's manageable. I remember when I was a young associate in the law firm, there was a Friday afternoon I was leaving. I would try to leave at least 2 hours before Shkia. Sometimes I would try 3 hours before Shkia. And I was leaving one Friday afternoon, and a junior partner in the law firm, who was not Orthodox, but he was traditional, came over to me and said, Bane, I'm so jealous of you. Your courage is incredible. You know, I'm also traditional, and I try to keep the Sabbath, the Shabbos, and Shabbat in my family. And my wife likes candles, and we have a kiddush, and our children sit around the table. But we're not Orthodox. And every Friday afternoon, I'm sitting here struggling Should I go home? There are emergencies. And I see that you, regardless of what's going on, always leave. You're so courageous. And I said, courageous? I'm not courageous. If I don't leave, I'm going to lose my marriage. I'm going to lose my community. It'd be courageous for me to stay. I'm leaving because that's who I am. And just like Kashrus is the same, and Shabbos is certainly the case, the world has learned to accommodate us if we're willing to be deliberate and thoughtful and have forethought. But there's another challenge that is far more significant and subtle that I find people falling prey to without considering that factor in choosing a career and a context. And that is when you choose a career that is very intense and very socially intense, that you're spending time with your colleagues and your clients or whoever else it is in your professional context, day after day, year after year, hours and hours and hours, you fall prey to beginning to look at the world through the prism of those who surround you. And that is an incredible danger. And anybody who says that, well, I'm not going to be vulnerable to that, I am so strong in my world perspective, don't appreciate the nature of the human mind. And we're very vulnerable to it. Now, not only is that a factor that should be taken into consideration, but is even more so a factor in creating antidotes to how I protect myself, because it may be an inevitability. And I think that what it teaches us is how important it is, even more so as you get into more and more of a commercial arena on an intense basis, of having a chevra that you retreat to, a group that you daven with, and that you learn with, and that you schmooze with. You know, I think that one of the failures I suggest in particularly, I'm a Litvish guy. I went through the Litvish yeshivas. I'm from a Litvish family. And one of the dimensions of lifestyle that my community almost frowns upon, that I find in the Hasidic community they are much more supportive of, is schmoozing with chevra. You know, I comment when if I'm in Williamsburg, stuck at in Williamsburg at a meeting, and I go to a local Meyer Stiebel at 10 o'clock, and the davening is over at 10:15. Everybody's sitting around schmoozing for another half hour, 45 minutes. In my neighborhood, when you go to a minyan at 10 o'clock at night and it's over at 10:15, by 10:16, the place is empty. I mean, you're sitting around schmoozing where you have nothing to do, you have nothing to learn, you have nothing to work, you have no time to spend with your family. That schmoozing has an incredible impact, particularly on the Ben Torah who's involved in the secular world on a daily basis. To have B'nai Torah that you're schmoozing with and looking at the world through, even if it's talking about politics, even if it's talking about business, the way you look at things is different than the secular world looks at it. And therefore, having a deliberate effort to having a chevra that are people that you are spending time with, both in learning, but even outside learning, I think is an important dimension of what you need to implement in your lifestyle.
Wow, so there's a lot there, and I really appreciated a lot of those insights. And I had a few follow-up questions. The first is that you described your own career as having two primary goals. One, parnasa for your family, which I understand that's a pretty basic one. And you also described it as being a foundation for the community work, the community position, the community roles that you wanted to apply yourself to. Can you talk a little bit more about that line and that connection and how you view those two things as going together?
Sure. So just to give you the context, I was enormously blessed in not only having an incredible relation with the Rebbe, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg Zatzal, but also having a tremendous chevra together with me in that relationship with Rabbi Weinberg. And what he emphasized to us and what he tried to instill in us and in all his talmidim throughout the years was an incredible sense of achrayus for Klal Yisrael. That part of your role, if not a primary part of your role, is to elevate the ruchnius of Klal Yisrael, not only your personal and your family's relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, as we were young, trying to develop our future and our aspirations, we all were imbued with this aspiration of trying to have an impact on Klal Yisrael. Now, among our chevra, most of us were incredibly significant talmidim. We were tremendous masmidim. We're going to be tremendous talmidei chachamim. Me, not so much. That wasn't where I was heading. Oh, I showed up to Seder, I learned my Siddharim, but I didn't have the Sitzfleisch, I didn't have the memory. I saw I wasn't heading in that direction to be a significant Talmid Chacham, as were most of my peers who were and did land up being significant Torah figures in Klal Yisrael, whether on a local or a larger level. So myself and one of the other of my chevras said, we're not going to be able to have that impact on Klal Yisrael through the Torah teaching, through the writing sparim or paskening shilas or teaching Torah either even directly. We're going to have to find a different route to have that impact. And therefore, the two of us decided we're going to go to law school. We're going to become lawyers. We're going to strive to be successful in our fields. But our primary objective would be to use that as a platform to be involved in different roles in Klal Yisrael, to have our impact, to play our role in that achrayus. And that's what we did. And, whether we made the right decision to begin with or not, I hope we did. I know that we spent our lives trying to have that impact. And Baruch Hashem, very often we were able to identify things to do that were very valuable.
And I'm curious who that friend was and why specifically law. Why do you think that was the field that would allow you to do those things?
Okay, my friend is Gedalia Litke, who's a very important balabas. He actually finished his legal career like I did. Now he's the director of arts, which is the certification for yeshiva system. And throughout the years, he also played a very significant role in helping both Yechidim and the community. And the reason we chose law was for a number of factors, but the primary factors were we were both ensconced in the yeshiva system for so many years that we really didn't know much about the outside world. Law is the most accessible field for a yeshiva guy. Number one, the prerequisites you need to have in terms of science backgrounds or different courses are minimal, if nothing at all. In fact, I have two sons who were in Kollel for years who went to law school without ever going to college altogether. Law is very unique in that regard. But in addition, what law provided was a platform to decide later what field you really wanted to go into, whether we should go into business, whether we should stay in law, etc. In fact, I had anticipated when I went to law school that I practice law for 2-3 years and then go into business and then try to become enormously wealthy to be able to play a role in Klal Yisrael. And I discovered that aspirational route was simply not a realistic route for me. I discovered after several years out of yeshiva that my risk tolerance level was far too intense, that I was too risk averse to hope to aspire to become wealthy in business. And therefore, I was much more comfortable in the legal world where I knew I was going to have at least in the ordinary course, b'siyata d'shmaya, a parnasa. But law also is a platform that has a degree of prestige in at least the American Orthodox community and the American secular community, even more so. And therefore, we felt, and it turns out to be true to some degree, that if you're successful in large law in particular, it gives you a credibility that when you enter into rooms with secular Jews and others, you have an automatic designation as someone who's due respect and deference. And in that regard, it was very successful. I should go back for a second and say the Gedalia Litke was enough of a masmid to have done it through Torah. I think that he was just enjoying our chevra shop, so we stayed together in our roots. But I don't want to impute his scholarship with my absences.
The other thing that you mentioned before, talking about your general approach to career decisions, is that there are these two masoras in Klal Yisrael about whether you're focused on the work itself or maybe the bigger picture impact of the work. And I actually, you maybe said that you were raised this way as a thing that you learned in yeshiva early on. I actually never heard of that before until you just taught it to me. Can you tell me a little bit more about where that comes from and where we see these two masoras?
I'm not scholarly enough to give you an adequate background to it. I know that Rav Weinberg was very explicit in identifying these two schools, and I was able throughout my life to see different Talmidim who took directives from their Rebbeim in one school or the other. I was told years ago that Chofetz Chaim was very clear in the impact orientation of Yiddishkeit, but we see very often to the contrary. I know that, for example, there's a very famous speech that Rav Aaron Kotler Zatzal gave at the opening. I don't know if it was the Cornerstone event or otherwise at Beis Medrash Gavoa in Lakewood, where one of the local Rabbanim got up and said, "Wow, we're creating this major Torah center that will produce Rabbanim and Malamdim and Roshei Yeshiva for the future generations of America." And Rav Aaron got up thereafter and said, "No, that's not the purpose of the yeshiva. The purpose of the yeshiva is not to produce people who are going to have an impact on Klal Yisrael. The purpose of the yeshiva is that people are going to learn Torah Lishmo without any other motivation at all. And that's what Klal Yisrael needs." So we see that there are different schools and different attitudes. And till today, you find that to be the case.
Okay, now I do think it's a very important framework and it's an essential one. It's the first time I had heard that in the broader sense. So I appreciate you sharing that as well. Let's talk a little bit more about family. We spoke more before about marriage, maybe to transition about being a father, having a home and kids. So we're actually coming up on Purim, and I had a very enlightening conversation with a good friend of the podcast, Zevi Reinitz, about how to do a Purim Suda when you have kids. Right? You go to yeshiva, and there's a certain image of what an ideal Purim Suda might look like, and there's obviously a lot of alcohol and a lot of singing and a lot of Torah and maybe deep Torah and she'ifos and so how do you approach creating frameworks where there's an optimized atmosphere for kids, for serious Avodas Hashem and Torah, but also family friendly?
I think that the Purim Suda is an example, but is not the best example. The best example is the Friday night Seudah. And the Friday night Seudah, in my view, and I think many, many people share this view, is the ultimate classroom for Yiddishkeit for your children. And I find very, very often parents fail to appreciate the intensity of that experience. My objective when my children were growing up was to make the Friday night Seudah the focus of their week, the most exciting, the most enjoyable, the most entertaining part of their experience. And that's not to say that there aren't other dimensions to what occurs at the Shabbos table, and similarly with regard to the Purim Suda. But I think that creating a Purim experience that your children will remember, that's what they look forward to, rather than the Super Bowl and rather than other kinds of events that the secular world will celebrate. But do you remember last year's Purim Suda? Remember what happened? It need not necessarily be sitting with your children and telling over Divrei Torah. It's the excitement, but making sure that it's excitement that does not scare them, but rather engages them, entertains them, shows them the Avodas Hashem that's involved in keeping mitzvahs and the simcha that is involved in keeping mitzvahs. Purim is an incredible opportunity to show children what simcha shel mitzvah is. If you're not creating an environment that's child-friendly, that's child-focused, even when you're spending time not talking to the child, but keeping in mind, how will my child be seeing this? What kind of experience, what kind of memory they will have of it? Then you're being derelict as a parent. But Purim, frankly, when we were growing up, we made Purim a major, major event, but we made every Friday night a major event. At least we tried to. And I think I've been at homes where I was just mentioning the other day, I remember when we were young and we were invited to someone's house for a Friday night Shabbos meal, and they invited a few families, and they had the adults sit in the dining room, the children sitting in the kitchen. I said, Mike, these people don't get it. I mean, what are you doing? Friday night is when it's all about children. Well, there's not enough rooms. Then you shouldn't invite these people. How could you? When we were young, we would never leave our children for a Shabbos bar mitzvah at a hotel and leave our children. That was the prime time of Avodas Hashem being taught to your children. You know, one of the laments that we have today, at least in American Orthodoxy, I can't speak to Eretz Yisrael, I don't live there, I'm not as familiar with it, that the attitude of many parents is, Klal Yisrael is taking care of my children. Klal Yisrael is teaching my children. I'm paying so much money in tuition. I'm involved in the shul. The school's going to teach my children. The camp is going to teach my children. The youth organization is going to teach my children. I remember when we were young, we would sit around the Shabbos table with other people, and they say, why don't children daven anymore? What are they teaching them in school? I say, school? That's where they should learn how to daven? Or even worse, kids have no midos today. What are they teaching them in school? Midos in school? That's where they should learn? You know, it's totally absurd. I remember my friend told me that he's a Rav, and someone came to him the other week and said, my young son, he just doesn't get the chashivas of davening. Just doesn't get it. How do I imbue to him the chashivas of davening? And my friend said to the balabas, he said, I know you take your son to shul on Shabbos, and Shabbos is nice. You know how you imbue? Take him when you go to Minyan for Sunday night. And show him davening Sunday night. That's how he's going to learn. He goes, well, I don't go to Minyan Sunday night. He goes, duh. Why do you think he's not machshav davening? So we have an opportunity on a consistent basis to be models for our children, to convey to our children, but it has to be our job, not the community's job, not the school's job. The school should be teaching them academics. We should be teaching them Avodas Hashem. We should be teaching them midos. We should be teaching them the intensity of what mitzvahs and the beauty and the sweetness of mitzvahs. That's what the job of a parent is. And there's no better place. And probably the primary place is the Shabbos table.
And can you give me a little bit more about how you personally, and it could be this will be a little bit different for individuals, but I am curious because I'm certainly looking for advice and hadracha in this regard. You have young kids. So again, going back to the yeshiva example, so the simcha shel mitzvah, the yeshiva guy's Suda is a brilliant Dvar Torah, Friday night, Purim or otherwise. Now you have little kids, and some of them maybe have a little bit of a grasp of the parsha and the meanings of the day, but barely. So where do you see the excitement of mitzvah coming to play? Is it about just having their favorite foods and making it exciting that way? Is it about singing? Is it about the divrei Torah that are applicable and relevant, or there's something else involved in making it that highlight, that Super Bowl moment that you're trying to do?
Well, I think that clearly singing, particularly on Purim, plays a very, very significant role. There's famous stories about the importance of Zemiros at the Shabbos table. I don't know. Our table was not heavy-duty Zmiras. I know a lot of my friends were. But when you talk about Divrei Torah, to me, that is the wild card. You can look at a Dvar Torah as, okay, in this week's Parsha, it says, and the Ramban says, or you could talk about Divrei Torah being concepts in Yiddishkeit, which younger children and even older children, maybe even more importantly, older children, are far more engaged in. I used to spend literally come out every Thursday night preparing for the Shabbos meals, identifying ideas that I wanted to develop at the Shabbos table, values I wanted to identify at the Shabbos table. Very often, not through this week's Parsha says, but through scenarios and through dynamics that were going on in my life. And when we talk about the excitement of it, and this I'm not sure that everybody could do as successfully as I, because I'm an incredible arguer, is I would try to elicit disputes at the Shabbos table, particularly with our Shabbos guests, and make that exciting, intense arguments that the kids would be sitting with their mouths gaping, looking at the intensity of the arguments, but they'd be listening. Children are very much like adults in a certain regard. By nature, a healthy family produces children who worship their parents. Unless there's a problem, shalom bias, or abuse in the family, a normal child wants to do and copy and model their parents and listen to everything their parents say. However, like adults, children don't like to be told what to do. I don't like to be told what to do. Even when I'm doing something wrong, I don't want to be told I'm doing something wrong. And children are no different. And therefore, when we lecture children, when we tell children, this is what you should be doing better, they automatically create a defense. And even though they want to listen to the parent, they're reluctant to because they have this defense that they created. I viewed the Shabbos table as an opportunity to be conveying to my children lessons by giving those lessons to other people at the Shabbos table in an intense, exciting manner. And they would eat it up because I wasn't telling them what to do. I was teaching values that they would therefore adopt as a matter of course. I would often hear them telling their friends things that we talked about at the Shabbos table that I'm sure, maybe not 100% sure, but 99% sure, if I had lectured them, you should be sharing with your friends when they wouldn't have accepted it. So the excitement is maybe singing for some people, maybe for most people, but it's raising issues in an exciting, intense way, telling stories that are engaging stories that have lessons in them. Those are ways of making things exciting. At the Purim Suda, having intense discussion, not diktuke halacha or looking in the pasuk says, but talking about the concepts of Purim in an emotional, intense way, particularly if you're able to make it an argument among two people of the Suda. I think it's this. Kids are going to eat it up and make it something that they're going to be listening to because it's so intense. That's going to be exciting.
Wow, that is exciting. You're getting me all hyped up for Purim already. So thank you so much. We covered maybe half of the questions I want to get to, but so many important insights, and maybe we'll do this again at some point. So Moishe Bane, thank you so much for coming on today, and we really appreciate all these ideas.
My pleasure. Hatzlacha Rabbah.